It's currently at 258 degrees.
I think we see the smoke, Steve.
You see the smoke? Andrew, can you see it okay? Did you get the shot? This is the best connector in the world. Look at it. We made it melt. Actually, we made multiple melt. We got one of these connectors over 250 degrees Celsius without any overclocking, resulting in the boiling, bubbling plastic that you're seeing and all the smoke that's pouring out of it. And that one that you just saw was actually the one that Igor's lab recently heralded as the potentially safer of the supply cables for 12-volt high power. So we've been working on this story for a few weeks. Rather than fly blind and theorize on what might be the problem, we've been trying to create the problems in the lab. This included sending our cables out to a failure analysis lab, which produced some of the X-rays and scanning electron microscope shots you're seeing now, in addition to spectrometry and chemical composition testing. They also mounted a damaged connector that we sent in epoxy and then cross-sectioned it for a clear picture. Further, we collected failed and working cables from 2 major adapter suppliers via our audience, including an NTK connector with 150-volt wiring. I then worked with Patrick to perform additional testing in-house while using the failure analysis lab's work to guide us in the correct direction. And we think we finally have some answers as to what's going on with these cables and what it means to you. This was one of our most expensive video series to produce this year in terms of time cost. It was 2 videos now. This should be about the final one, other than some quick follow-ups we'll do. And it was all worth it just to do the right thing and try and root cause this issue and get to hard answers on it. We brought you this extensive video via store.gamersnexus.net. For the next week only, use code THISISFINE for 10% off the GN store at checkout. Our 3D coaster packs and the brand new debug pack are in stock and shipping now, featuring the 4 unique drink coasters that you're seeing with high quality, flexible materials that are easy to clean. We also have stock of the GN Large mod mats, which, notably, are heat resistant for tube bending and great for PC building with wiring diagrams, screw tracking grids, and for protecting your components as they are anti-static and include grounding hardware. Finally, you should also check out some of our mouse mats, like the black and blue wireframe mouse mat or the red and black HUD mouse mat. Buying stuff from the store helps to fund these deep dives that we do and to pay for all the staff, time, and equipment costs that we incur during the process. Go to store.gamersnexus.net and use code THISISFINE. All right, so this video is going to be dense and packed with a lot of scientific information, some really cool testing, and actual failure that we were able to produce on the cables, plus failure analysis lab external testing. Super cool stuff. And the goal for this is to be extremely clear and direct and give everyone firm notes to take home about what does all this actually mean about the cable. No more theory craft, no more just straight up fear in the headlines. We're focusing on trying to get everyone some answers. So first off, the frequency of occurrence. This is important to put things in perspective. So while there have been frequent Reddit posts on like the PC building subreddits, you've likely seen a number of these connectors fail at this point and burn up. So we did some digging and working with board partners, collecting information just from viewers, and also talking to cable suppliers. We were able to ascertain through those NVIDIA partners that they believe the failure rate is about 0.05 to 0.1% right now. And of course, NVIDIA may provide more context to that later. What cables can fail is the next thing we need to answer. The short answer is all of them can fail. So they're all capable of melting like you've seen online. And that's because there's a few modes of failure that we're going to go through today, and one of them involves user error. Igor's lab recently reported some findings on suppliers, and we disagree with many of the conclusions in those statements. We're going to get to that, but the supplier side information is accurate. So there's Astron, which is the officially sanctioned NVIDIA supplier. NVIDIA hires them, they work with them directly. That's the one that's supposed to be making the cables that are used by and large by 4090s. There's another supplier called NTK, and NTK also subcontracts to a supplier called 3Con. So there's basically 3 that are really in play here. There's one officially sanctioned. There's one that board partners like Zotac have opted to use for some of their connectors. And relating to all this, Igor stated the following, quote, "By the way, I now only use the NTK adapters privately and have not had a single failure with them." Quick interruption here. Igor has not had a single failure, period. So the units that he talked about previously were units he tore apart to theorize why a failure might happen, but those units did not in fact fail unless something's changed in the last 12 hours or so. Continuing the quote, of course, it would be somewhat speculative to make a blanket statement as to whether this is pure coincidence or really indicates a better quality of contacts, but I already feel a little safer. And for the gaming system, thank goodness I have a native cable on the power supply. I already wrote the adapters should only be a real emergency solution. At this point, we've made cables from multiple suppliers fail. That includes Astron. That includes the favorite here, NTK. Additionally, you can make native 12-volt high power cables fail. There have been some from users online, but with the testing we're doing today, you'll see why it can happen to anyone, including Cable Mod, for example, for their upcoming cables. So they're all prone to failure. However, the failure in general is overwhelmingly uncommon based on the statistics that we have today, and many of the failures are actually very easily avoidable. Not all of them, but the vast majority are. Let's get into that. Here's what makes them fail as quickly as possible. We'll go into supporting evidence in a moment. So one of them, foreign object debris in the cable. This is caused by improper manufacturing or by scraping of the bumps within the connector combined with high current and or poor connection. Pins can scrape on the bumps of the connection and create debris that can heat up inside the plastic by creating poor points of contact. This is something we had validated by a third-party failure analysis lab. Additionally, another point of failure would be extremely improper insertion by the user, which we posited in our original piece. To recap our statements there, we basically said it could be user error. At the time, we weren't able to create that scenario. We have now. We'll talk about that. And even if it is user error, at some point, it's like if the design is so bad that it encourages user error with any amount of regularity, then it is a combination of user error plus design error. So the last point we had as a potential failure is improper insertion in combination with a taut wire on one or more pins, causing at least 1 point of poor contact that heats rapidly and melts as a result of a parallel high resistance conductive path. We made this animation to help demonstrate what we mean inside the connector housing and show what we're really talking about, what we're going to test later. To be very clear, these are not theories. The two about improper insertion by the user, those we have tested ourselves and caused the failure. The one about foreign object debris is from a failed connector from a user that we sent in to an FA lab. Just want to be really clear because a lot of stuff out there is theory crafting, and we want to make sure this isn't mistaken for that. Those are facts. We have created those failures here. All right, it's had enough.
That's got a distinct odor.
In effort of continuing to responsibly report on it, our sample size is small here. In the original story, we worked on 5 cables. In this one, we have one failed adapter donated by a viewer that we've cross-sectioned with the help of the FA lab that a different viewer works at. And we have 2 failed adapters and counting that we created in-house tonight for the adapters. You can get 12-volt high-power native cables to fail as well. And what we have here is a representative sample, but even so, we can't say that the findings apply to literally every single failed 12-volt high-power connector out there, but we do think that this accounts for probably the vast majority of failures at this point. Also, we strongly caution against basing conclusions off of connectors which haven't failed. To examine a connector that hasn't melted and conclude that's why it melted doesn't make any sense. It's creating a reality which does not exist. Oh, it smells bad. All right.
Oh yeah, now we have smoke. Okay, we got smoke.
See the smoke?
I think you see the smoke. Yeah, I think you see it.
You can see it bubbling.
Let's move into debunking some of these. So weak solder joints is the first one. This is an older theory, and in this one, cross-sectioning one failed adapter revealed one solder joint with a lack of fillet on the 12-volt side of the plug, but not on the heat-damaged pin. Our lab contacts dismissed this as the root cause since the bond still looks strong. It shows no sign of heat damage, and it's reinforced by the strain relief. He also noted that the solder appears to be a tin-silver alloy used for high-temperature applications. So this particular failure was not caused by weak solder joints. Each plastic pin on the male side of NVIDIA's adapter cable contains a conductive metal socket. Each of these metal sockets is split down the middle with 3 dimples on each side. When inserted into the GPU, the two halves of each metal socket act as leaf springs that hold the 6 dimples against a metal pin on the GPU side. This provides a path for electricity. Spectroscopic analysis shows the metal parts of the connector contain a copper layer, which is then coated with nickel as an adhesion layer, then tin as an outer protective layer. Note 0.7 and 0.8 in this image of the burned connector as well. The visible outer coating is mostly tin with some carbon baked on. Now, every adapter cable that we've received with RTX 4090s for review have used the Astron style connector that NVIDIA officially is supporting. And that's the dimple type connector with the split sockets. It's the one that's supposed to be shipping, especially with the FE cards. We do have an NTK style one that's been called the tulip style, at least via translation from Igor. And that one we received from a viewer, but they are not the default NVIDIA specified cable. It's one that's been sourced as a second supply. Examination of the Astron adapters, melted or otherwise, reveals that the tin and nickel layers are immediately scraped away through normal use, revealing copper underneath. As you can see in this overlay, the tin layer in blue has been pushed aside, and the copper layer in orange is visible. Over time, the copper will oxidize here, raising the resistance. And our failure analysis lab contact wasn't particularly happy about the build quality of the cable, specifically the lack of durability is what he was dissatisfied with. But he also made it clear that oxidation would be a much longer term process than what we're looking at right now today, and then the failures we're investigating. Oxidation is not the cause of our melted adapter, according to our contact. Now, this next theory is one we had a lot of requests to test, and it was initially posited by Buildzoid. We thought it was one of the best and most sensible theories early on, and we worked with Buildzoid on doing some testing for this particular one and a couple of other ideas. And note, of course, he doesn't have access to cables or cards, so we were able to sort of be the proxy for that. Now, his theory was that the double split terminal at the end, where if you look at the end of the cable, you can see it splits in 2 spots, and he thought that perhaps as those get pried farther apart from maybe wiggling at the end of the connector on the video card, that could cause a failure. And all the testing we did for that resulted in the same thermals we saw in our stock cable testing, so it effectively eliminated this theory from the list of most probable causes. Perhaps it could happen. We, however, were not able to recreate this failure despite spending hours, actually a couple days, pushing the splits farther apart and testing over and over. Now, he next suggested we do this. We cut all of the 12-volt pins off except for 2, and then we ran it under a 600-watt load. The result was the same for thermals as before, more or less, a couple degrees max. So what we mean is we ran all the power from these 4 8 pins into just 2 12-volt pins on the actual connector. That's a hell of a lot of strain on 2. Presumably you go down to 1 and it might behave the same way. It did not fail though, and in fact it didn't even really heat up. So as for the question of is thermal imaging sufficient, the answer is yes, and not only because we stuck probes in onto the 12-volt pins internally, but also because we'll show you. Because we had the same question, and this is what it looks like when it fails next to what it looks like when it was cut and working normally. And you can see that the failure is extremely clear when it's going to happen. It ramps incredibly fast, and it gets into thermal runaway pretty quickly. So the fact that the cable survived with all the current going through 2 fully seated pins, properly connected, told us that it's unlikely that the cable standalone is at fault. But note, properly connected there. So that led us to potentially another catalyst. So now that we've ruled out some of the most obvious theories that have been sort of discussed the last few weeks, let's build our own theory based on sort of the evidence and the data we've collected here. After discussion with our failure lab contact, the most likely cause in at least the viewer cable that we're looking at that failed is heat generated through a parallel high resistance conductive path. In other words, in addition to the normal and intended dimple to pin connections across the mating surfaces, there was also some weak, unintentional connection with high resistance along the same path. This can occur on the NTK tulip style connectors as well. A high resistance means heat, and multiple cycles of that means that eventually you're going to have a toasted connector. And there are a couple of ways that a parallel path could form. X-ray analysis of the adapter did show FOD, or foreign object debris, molded into the rubber strain relief around the solder joints, but it was not enough to cause a short. and it was in a different area than the one where damage occurred. The debris are the dark specks scattered around the inside of the strain relief in these images. We've already shown that the tin and nickel coating of the adapter is scraped off through normal use, which could leave debris floating around the socket. Our contact also noted metal burrs left over from manufacturing on the melted adapter, particularly on the end of the metal socket. Now, this was the theory that our contact originally favored. That is, until we were able to do some more in-house testing tonight and finally reveal some more about potentially a mixture of user error and design, maybe oversight, shortcoming, also coming into play. Now, regardless of what actually formed that connection, we know that something did, because the X-ray shows us it did, and so does the part where there was fire. The tip of the metal socket in the melted connector is ground zero. This is significant because the tip of the metal socket isn't intended to connect to anything. That's what the dimples are for. The presence of a pyrolyzed material and electrical damage at the tip of the connector is the smoking gun that we were looking for. EDS, or energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy analysis, shows that the burnt materials are organic in the chemistry sense, meaning containing carbon. That means it could be the remains of debris from the plastic connector. Our contact's theory was this, quote, "For a moment in time, the synced current through this FOD exceeded its current carrying capacity, which melted and deposited the material at that location, and likely to the pin side too. Then, if a higher parallel resistance remained through the melted FOD, the connector pin and socket would continue to heat through power dissipated through that point. This was what I think occurred for this connector," that's one sent in by a viewer, "socket based on our observations above." Now, we also identified some dense material inside the damaged connector, mostly tin with some nickel. This is plating, but our failure analysis lab contact believes it's probably plating from the GPU pin side rather than the adapter. According to him, quote, "The fact that we see tin and nickel with no copper means that the tin or nickel had a clean separation from the base metal, copper. That phenomenon can happen with contaminants present during the nickel plating process, or oxidation of the base metal prior to nickel plating." To really firmly make all this concrete, we would need that viewer's 4090, but unfortunately, we don't have it because they want it, understandably, and they're getting it replaced as we understand it. So that's as far as that particular analysis can go. Delaminating plating isn't good, if that's what's happening here. But based on our other findings, we don't believe it's the cause of melting, or at least not the primary one. As we said, there's one major last piece of the puzzle, and that's the partial insertion of the connector. This is the one we had previously conducted some testing on for our first piece, but we noted we weren't able to create a failure. Now, in that testing, the partial connection was approximately, I can't plug it into that one, it's melted. I was going to show it, but it was approximately 1 millimeter of connector sticking out, meaning it was primarily inserted with 1 millimeter remaining before it fully clicked into place. That's what we did originally. It's enough for someone to feel like it's connected properly, but to not be. So it provides some resistance, doesn't fully click because these cables don't really click, which is part of the potential design oversight, we think, but it's enough that we thought it was a reasonable use case where someone would not properly install it, but also an experienced user could make that mistake still. So that didn't cause the failure initially, or now even. We also tried pulling it to the side, where we basically strained the cable really hard on one side. We had about 1.5 to 2 millimeters exposed on the farthest set of 2 or 3 pins, and that also did not produce a failure. So what we were missing then was we didn't know just how poor the contact has to be. It's bad. And we can prove that some of the failed connectors that you've seen online were leaving upwards of 4 to 4.5 millimeters of the cable end unsocketed. As for proving it, here's where the forensics come into play. There are clear wear lines on the damaged connector that was sent to us by a viewer, which imply that the adapter was only inserted 4 millimeters on the better side, out of a total of 6.5 millimeters. And the plastic pins on the adapter are bent sharply at that point, implying that the connector softened and was pulled sideways. And remember, it's heating up, so softening here, of course, makes sense. And that's away from the A at the end of the NVIDIA logo and down towards the 12-volt side of the adapter. We've seen photos of other failed cables online, on Reddit, and we've seen identical wear marks on some of the connectors that we've been able to source. With that in mind, we set out to recreate that problem working with Patrick and Andrew late at night. Tonight, here's how that went. So this is climbing very fast. This normally takes like probably 15-20 minutes to get to 50-something degrees. You can see there's a really hot spot there. So we are probably going to get a melting cable this time. 57 degrees.
The connector's hotter than the GPU.
Are you saying Fortnite players are the kind who would not socket the cable correctly?
I don't know how many watts you can pull with Fortnite.
So, all right, this is not overclocked. And shockingly, it's actually worse than the last one. The last one we had to overclock and push 600 watts through to get to 112 plus degrees.
Do you want to overclock this one first?
Yeah, let's overclock it. So, just so you
I see
know.
you applied it.
Oh, yeah, I see. Okay, yeah,
I'm not done yet.
You might be done in a second. 154.
Holy shit.
157.
Jesus Christ.
160.
It's 163 degrees right now.
165.
Yeah, this is why you don't jump to conclusions without testing. This is the cable that's the best. The supply doesn't fucking matter if you don't plug it in. And this is where we get to the part where some people in the audience might be unhappy because you've been hearing theory after theory about how basically NVIDIA is either evil or incompetent or both. And it's looking like there's a little bit more to it than just that. This time, the 4080 16 gigabyte. So this problem isn't unique to a specific cable or a specific manufacturer or adapters versus native cables. This is just, all it requires is the ability to power the card on without a fully seated cable. And there is a point where it just won't turn on if it's too unseated, but that point isn't until pretty late in the unseating process. On Igor's piece, his newest one, he reported that the sense pins might get shortened via PCI SIG, which would help with this problem. Another thing that would help is if they implement a simple detection circuit, basically, that detects if it's seated or not, and that is doable. It's on cables. So our conclusion here, our data-based one, is that cables are melting when the connector is partially unseated. We've finally been able to recreate it, but it required being very unseated and also pulling the cable at an angle. Because we tested it unseated without pulling it at an angle, it didn't fail even when it was equivalently unsocketed. So pulling it at the angle so that the GPU's metal pins are in contact by the tip of the metal socket rather than the intended mating surface is what caused it on the two failures we did tonight. In our experiments, this happened at the inner radius of the bend. This shares some ground with the FOD theory as well, which is a weak, high resistance path for current in parallel with the intended path. As stated by our lab contact, quote, this partial insertion and angling of the pin into the socket could have increased susceptibility for a high resistance parallel connection at the lip of the socket. And if there's any burrs or debris, like from connection hanging off the lip of that, it could make things worse as well. So the reason we couldn't get it to fail with less bend and more inserted, but still incorrect socketing, was because this path was not created. And additionally, it may take substantially more time for the slightly improper connection to cause a failure, whereas the truly bad, you'd really have to be an inexperienced user for this, connection would only take minutes to start failing. There are multiple reasons. Those reasons are foreign object debris. The foreign object debris could be caused by manufacturing error or by design oversight itself. Like with the dimples to pin contact, you can create some of that, or there could be some that's already in there, or it could come from the user scenario, but user's environment. But either way, foreign object debris is one. Another one, heat generated through a parallel high resistance conductive path caused by foreign object debris. Another one, extremely bad user error, like bad contact in combination, especially with a taut wire that causes the bad sort of pin to terminal contact we were talking about earlier. And to recap the earlier part, all 12-volt high power cables can fail in at least one of these methods, probably multiple, because FOD can happen in either case, although maybe there's more error at one factor or another. but certainly user error can happen in all of them. And that was something we tried exploring. We just didn't know the level of effort it would really take to make it show itself. Failures are rare. They are fewer than like 0.1% at this point, as we calculated earlier based on the information we have available today. This leads into commentary on some of Igor's lab's research on NTK versus Astron connectors. Don't go trying to chase down a specific adapter. It's a fool's errand. It's a waste of your time. And we're greatly concerned that the anxiety around this issue is causing more failures, because people are out there unsocketing their connectors all the time, checking it. Did it melt yet? Is it going to melt? Is it starting to melt? And we're worried that because the easiest to create failures are from foreign object debris, which happens from insertion cycles, and we don't think that's the most common failure, to be extremely clear about that, but it is one that you can create. Foreign object debris or user error, which is also from insertion cycles. We're worried that a lot of people are out there checking it and potentially creating a problem by being careless with it, or just getting unlucky and having the wire be a little bit more taut next time than the first time. Purely objectively, with our findings, with these numbers, with the failures we have, we believe you should feel comfortable using a 12-volt high power connector in general, but it requires and is critical that you connect it and seat it fully. You should not be able to see anything between the bottom of where sort of the whole housing comes together. There shouldn't be any gap in there between the connection of the cable and the connector. Also, avoid pulling the cable taut, especially as we said towards sort of that A on the NVIDIA logo. Now, other than manufacturing defects with foreign object debris, on the user error side of problems, we think that most of them look like the footage you're seeing now. This level of connection did not get even a little bit warmer in testing than fully socketed tests, but it isn't secure. We think it's possible that a user routing the cables and managing them in this state could lead to inadvertently loosening this connection because it feels secure, but it's not actually latched. It needs a much firmer push to get into the socket. To be sure yours is latched, push until it's uncomfortable and you can't walk it out like we can in this shot. It's also possible that cables slightly walk themselves out with vibration from all the computer fans, but most likely it starts out acceptable but incorrect and accidentally gets tugged to being meltable. Finally, just a really as brief as possible monologue about responsible reporting here. The last couple weeks have been incredibly difficult for us to do this testing, and it's because of the landscape around us that was driven by just reporting that really wasn't up to the research par that it needs to be for a matter this serious. And it's uncomfortable for me to add this monologue section because it involves some constructive criticism of our peers whom we like. So that's a little bit of a challenge, and we've encountered this multiple times now with responsible reporting and trying to create reasonable discourse. And when you have people screaming at the top of their lungs all of these really sensationalized headlines and claiming that they found the problem when in fact they have no proof of finding the problem, it makes it hard for us to come in later and to have that reasonable discourse with the audience, because we're entering basically a preloaded minefield of opinions that may not align with the reality of testing. So whenever this stuff blows up, there's a lot of pressure where people start pinning us and saying, when are you going to cover it? This is not a woe is us thing. We are so thrilled to have that because people are engaged. They want to hear what we think. We really appreciate you actually caring about what it is we do and wanting to see that, because it's exciting to us to work on it too. But because of that, we just want you to know that if we're like a week or 2 weeks late to something and everyone's posting all of these things about why a failure is happening, but they haven't actually produced it, know that we are trying to, and we're in the lab trying to desperately keep up with theories, which is very hard to do when you're limited by testing speed, especially for heat-based scenarios where it takes time. So that's really all there is to the monologue. It's not meant to be a slight on others. I like Jay, I like working with them, like hanging out with them, I like his content. I've met Igor at Computex, got along with him pretty well. We've talked in the past about his work. And it's been a frustrating month to cover this story. It means we have to wade into an environment that is preloaded with a lot of opinions and a fiery audience that is misinformed or only partially informed. And that makes it hard for us to do our job, because then we enter it. And if our opinion doesn't match the theories that don't have testing backing them, it's like suddenly we are de facto apologists of the company if we are unable to produce those failures based on those theories. That's my TED Talk. Thanks for coming. It's not meant to be like I'm not trying to take away from the content for this, but I did need to say it at this point because it's become a problem lately. So that's why if we're late, now you know. Thanks for watching, though. Hopefully that recaps it well for you. Subscribe for more as always. You can support us directly by going to store.gamersnexus.net and using code THISISFINE for 10% off anything on the store for the next week or so. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.